Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto turns into a fox during a full moon. Pre-timescope, no Biju, Konoha is a village of ninjas who hunt demons. Naruto is a ninja with secrets. And tonight is the night of a full moon. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 40, Full Moon. Uchiha Mikoto shivered slightly as she made her way back home through the village's dark and deserted streets. It was very late, so late that it was technically the very early morning hours of the next day. She'd almost considered calling home and asking Itachi to bring her an overnight bag so that she could spend the night in Kushina's hotel room, but by the time she'd thought of that it was already so late that her elder son was probably asleep in his own bed. Unwilling to disturb him, she left the hotel as soon as she was certain that her old friend was asleep, and would stay that way until the sun rose. Uzumaki Kushina had always been a passionate person, a loud person. Whenever she was angry about someone or at someone, she made sure that people knew about it. But no matter how fiery her rage, how deep her outrage, how greatly whatever it was had upset her, she was coherent, and it was possible for a patient soul to weather her outbursts and talk her down into outward calmness. This particular instance had been very different. Kushina had been utterly irrational. She'd railed against Byakuchi Kashoku for reasons she'd never gotten around to properly explaining. The redhead had made accusations that he'd somehow managed to impersonate Minato all the way down to his smell, how she remembered how her old boyfriend had smelled and how Kushina had gotten close enough to smell him properly. Mikoto had no idea, in some bizarre plot to drive her insane. Despite the woman's clear physical exhaustion, it had taken Mikoto hours and almost an entire bottle of plum wine to get Kushina to collapse into a fitful sleep. And even after all of that, Mikoto worried that when Kushina woke up again her old friend still wouldn't be properly defused and capable of controlled, rational thought and action. Could Minato's loss have scarred her so badly that her return to Konoha has broken something loose in her head? It seemed rather likely to Mikoto now. For all her friend's strength and fearlessness, there had to be a limit, and it appeared that the redhead had finally reached it. And with some of the odd threats that Kushina had hurled against her hated fellow Izunin. "I'll rip off his tails, the bastard." That specific threat, which Kushina had snarled innumerable times along with more datebanes than she'd heard in years, had really concerned Mikoto. Men don't have tails, the Uchiha woman thought as she reached the boundary between her clan's land and the rest of the village. Not human men, anyway, unless she was using slang. And Kashoku is as human as Kushina is. Mikoto sighed as she walked the paved pathway towards her own front door. I need to check in with her later, hopefully before she pulls herself together enough to do something stupid. She paused just short of her door and glanced over her shoulder to see the moon hanging near the horizon. It looked full, but it wasn't quite yet. The full moon was tomorrow night. A chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air prickled down her spine, and Mikoto hurried indoors. Naruto snapped upright in his bed and gasped for breath, one hand clutching at his sweaty shirt. His blue eyes darted around the darkened room, searching for danger. When his brain woke up enough to recognize that he was safe and alone, he sighed and shuddered. Just a dream, just a dream, just a dream. The blonde boy shivered again. Well, nightmare, not dream. But anyway, I'm okay. The longer he sat in his bedroom awake, the more distant his terror became. The red spinning eyes and sharp silver knives faded from a reality to a hazy shadow at the back of his mind. And once his feeling of relief peaked, he realized how chilly his damp skin found the air to be. He grimaced as he disentangled himself from his sheets and pulled his sticky clothing away from his body. After turning on the lamp so that he could see what he was doing, the boy did his best to fix his sheets and mattress before giving up the effort. Naruto padded through the dark hallway to the bathroom to answer nature's call, get a drink of water, and get a towel. It never crossed his mind to seek comfort from an adult for the nightmare. When he'd been small, he had always climbed into bed with his mother until he fell asleep again, calmed by her warmth and the soothing rhythm of her heartbeat. But that had been a very long time ago, and he'd since learned to take care of himself, as very few of his foster homes had been sympathetic to his occasional night terrors. I wonder what time it is? Naruto mused as he scrubbed his blonde hair with the towel. It's pretty dark, so it has to be late still. Or is it just really, really early? There weren't many clocks in the house. There was a clock mounted on the wall in the kitchen, and a digital alarm clock in the other bedroom. Going downstairs to check the time seemed like too much of a chore, and peeking at the alarm clock would be tricky as. "You're up early." Naruto let out a strangled squeak and whirled around to confront the speaker. "Don't sneak up on me like that," the boy snapped, waving the towel angrily at the adult. The adult, his father, stood in the bathroom doorway, leaning his shoulder against the door frame. He didn't look entirely awake as he squinted against the bathroom lights. If Naruto's sneaking around hadn't awakened him, the glow spilling out of the open doorway had probably done it. "I didn't mean to," the man shrugged. Naruto fidgeted with the towel before hanging it up on a hook near the shower stall. "What time is it?" "A little after 5:30 in the morning," the Umbu informed him, and then yawned. "You have trouble sleeping." "It's no big deal," Naruto muttered, avoiding the adult's increasingly alert gaze. "If you say so," was the dubious response. "Well, you might as well take your shower now. I'll see to breakfast." "Okay," the boy agreed. His father gave him a long look before slowly nodding and walking away. Naruto stayed still until he heard the faint creak of the stairs. When he was sure that he was alone, he closed the bathroom door, stripped off his damp pajamas, and turned on the water for his shower. Tonight's going to be the night. Naruto swallowed and ducked under the hot water, groping around for the shampoo bottle. "I wonder if Mom will make it." Kushina braced her hands against the shower wall as steaming hot water poured down her back. It was well past morning and just a few hours shy of noon, much later than she would have liked to be getting started with her day. If only she hadn't been so tired, and if only Mikoto hadn't knocked her out with all that wine. Bleh, just got drunk enough for a little hangover. She hadn't blacked out a moment of the night before, however. With almost perfect clarity she could recall her freak-out/tantrum, and the event which had triggered the whole mess. And, really, she wished that she'd gotten drunk enough to have forgotten about the whole thing for at least a few hours. Of course, my headache would be a hell of a lot worse if that was the case. Then I would have puked at least once, maybe twice. And then after all that agony, I'd remember why, and feel even worse. The water started to feel cool against her bare skin, and Kushina fumbled with the knob to adjust the temperature. If Mikoto hadn't restrained her with alcohol, Kushina probably would have stormed out of her hotel room moments after rolling out of bed. She wouldn't have wasted time bathing or changing her clothes and gone on the hunt for one Byakuchi Koshoku. When she found him she would have attacked him with everything that she had, up to and including going demonic on him, regardless of where she found him. And it all would have been a terrible mistake. When her hungover self had stumbled into the shower several minutes earlier, it had slowly occurred to her that Koshoku might not be responsible for the Minato she'd encountered the previous evening. She remembered how the house where Naruto was being kept always seemed to smell like her lost boyfriend, and her first visit had been before she'd revealed her presence to Koshoku, not to mention that Koshoku had no idea where Naruto's hiding place was. Therefore, the chances that Koshoku had actually done what she'd suspected were now worse than remote. Maybe it was some Uchiha, then. Itachi, perhaps. I haven't seen that kid yet, he might have gone and followed his daddy's awful example. She bit her lip in thought and finally bothered to start washing her long, red hair. But even the best Sharingan spawned genjutsu is limited by the caster's imagination. There's no way that any Uchiha would think to include smell into the illusion. None of them would have any idea how important that sense is to me, being that I'm a fox and all. As civilized as Kitsune are, we still pay more attention to scent than the average human does. If it wasn't Koshoku or some Uchiha, though, then. It can't really be him. Fully realized werewolves can never turn back. Everybody agrees on that. All the old stories about Madara being able to switch between man and wolf monster at will are totally bogus. Mangetsu can't be Minato because he was in the shape of the man, able to speak like a man. Kushina methodically lathered up her lengthy locks with shampoo and then carefully rinsed the foam off. Satisfied that she had gotten all the shampoo out, she rubbed in the conditioner. With such long hair she needed it to be able to get a brush through her tresses without destroying them. As she started her second rinse cycle, she made a decision. I need to talk to the Hokage and find out just who Mangetsu is. She probably also apologized to the old man for trashing that training ground, again, but that was one of the last things on her mind. Naruto finished his lunch and leaned back in his chair to glance towards his guardian and father. The adult had spent most of the morning whispering into his radio, putting together supplies for the coming night, and receiving things from various other that had stopped by. Naruto had just stayed out of the way and watched from the living room couch. But now it was the afternoon, and if they were going to make it to the place that Mangetsu had mentioned the day before, they would probably have to leave soon. So are we going to sneak out now? If you're all done eating. When Naruto nodded, he continued. All right, then. The Nin put all the used dishes in the sink for later washing and then briefly left the kitchen. He returned with a pack on his back, a bag for Naruto, and a pair of sandals. Naruto had already gotten some new clothes, not pajamas, real clothes, khaki pants and a black t-shirt, so all he needed for a walk in the woods were shoes. The genin hurriedly pulled on the sandals and pack and waited for further instructions. Now, the settled his wolf mask over his face and reached over to grip the boy's shoulder. Hang on. Wah. There was a dizzying rush of disorientation, a sharp tug. Naruto blinked, and he quite abruptly found that they were outdoors instead of indoors. The boy wobbled for a moment. Gah. What the how did I figured that it would be too difficult to slip through the village walls unseen since you haven't really exercised lately, so I used my high ration to make a little shortcut, his father cheerfully explained. So, are we there, already? Naruto asked, still reeling a bit from the unexpected translocation. No, I brought us just out of sight of the village walls, Mangetsu answered. The hike to the outpost should be a nice easy warm-up for you before the moon rises. Okay. Naruto followed the as he turned and started trekking deeper into the forest. Could you have brought us right there? Yes, the man nodded. If I've left a special seal marker somewhere, I can go there, no matter how far away it is. Wow. I could use that to set off fireworks all over the village and no one would be able to pin it on me. Can you teach me how to do that? Sure, the agreed, when you become a Jonin. What? Naruto squawked, nearly tripping on a fallen branch. Why? It's a very complex technique that involves advanced seal work and bending space and time, the senior ninja explained. And it has the potential to be very dangerous. I'd like for you to be more experienced and mature before I even try to teach it to you. Okay, the boy huffed, very disappointed. There are plenty of other things for you to learn between now and then, was the cheery response. And the next few weeks we'll see how many of these other things I can squeeze in before the final trial. What do you mean he's busy? The Chunin-level secretary in charge of managing the Hokage's schedule and giving unscheduled visitors permission to visit the village leader quailed under Kushina's ugly glare, but didn't break. Hokage-sama is booked solid with meetings today, the male secretary repeated. He's too busy to see unscheduled petitioners. Perhaps, if you came back before the office closes at 6:30. That's too late. Kushina snapped. I just have one little question for him, it'll take 5 minutes less for him to answer it. I'm sorry, the Chunin said. The scheduling is just too tight. Hokage-sama needs to get status reports on the demon collection for the final trial. And he also needs to prepare for Uchiha Fugaku and Uchiha Tekka's formal judgment. If he's not expecting to see you, I can't work you in. I don't suppose I can bribe you. Kushina growled, feeling intensely frustrated. No, the secretary almost snorted. What if I hit you over the head? She suggested darkly. That would get you ejected from the tower, the Chunin informed her. Well. Uzumaki Kushina. The redhead scowled and glanced over her shoulder to find an Nin. He was clearly a different one from the night before. This had dark hair, a different mask, and a wholly unfamiliar voice and scent. Yes. She replied warily. Mangetsu asked me to escort you to the meeting place, if you're still interested, the stranger told her. Would I have to follow you now? If you'd like to make it there before sunset, yes. Kushina grimaced. If she passed on his offer and waited to possibly get a moment to speak with the Hokage about Mangetsu's true identity, she would miss spending time with Naruto. If she went with him, she'd miss getting to talk to the Hokage for sure, but she would also get a second look at Mangetsu in the flesh. Alright, Kushina muttered, turning away from the secretary to face the Umbu. Let me get my bag and we'll go. Ino pouted as she, Chuji, and Shikamaru walked home from practice. Even though they didn't live particularly close to each other, they'd stick together on the way home from the training grounds, slowly breaking apart when they reached their own neighborhoods. It was something they'd always done, from their first days in the academy on. Some adults suck at keeping promises, the blonde girl fumed as she walked between Shikamaru and Chuji. The previous evening the woman who was supposed to be Naruto's mother had promised to come find her, or Sakura, and Sasuke, and find out what they knew about Naruto, mainly, that he'd freaked out on Hinata and needed her so that she could take care of him, and she had failed to show up. Really, what's more important? Some meeting that she had to get to, or her kid? Is something wrong, Ino? Chuji asked between mouthfuls of potato chips. It's a long story, Ino muttered as she struggled to find a starting point so that the two boys could properly appreciate her irritation. Troublesome, Shikamaru grunted. I hate it when you say that damn word, you lazy ass. Ino snapped. Is there anything that you don't find troublesome? Cloud watching, the Nara boy replied. Of course, the Yamanaka girl groaned. The laziest activity ever. It's so lazy, it probably doesn't even count as an activity. He could have said that he finds napping the least troublesome, Chuji happily pointed out. Ino made a growling sound in the back of her throat and tossed her head to move the long bangs from her eyes. But then her irritation faded a bit as an idea came to her. For a moment she was tempted to grin evilly, but she restrained herself so that Chuji and more importantly Shikamaru didn't catch on. Well, you don't find puzzles all that troublesome, right? Puzzles are very troublesome, Shikamaru countered. They make me think until I solve them. Too bad for you, then, Ino smirked. I've got a real puzzle for you. I'm not listening, Shikamaru muttered and tried to peel off their route early, but she easily caught his arm and prevented his flight. The puzzle is, Naruto, Ino said. Shikamaru stopped and gave her an odd look. The ramen ingredient or the kid from our class? Our old classmate, idiot. The blonde girl snapped impatiently. How is a ramen ingredient a puzzle? It could have been part of a riddle, the Nara boy shrugged. Whatever, Ino snorted. The puzzle is Naruto, the kid with no family name. I'm going to tell you a bunch of interesting but confusing facts about him, and you're going to make it make sense for me. Shikamaru's usual bored expression turned a bit pinched as if her words were causing him some physical pain. So very troublesome. Naruto hiked his pack up on his back and squinted into the fading light as he did his best to follow his Umbu guide. His legs were feeling a bit tired as he'd exerted himself more than he had since his injury, but he felt fine otherwise. It had helped that they'd stopped an hour or so ago to have a cold dinner that had been among the supplies packed in the backpacks. What really bothered him about the hike was the quiet. Mangetsu didn't seem to mind the lack of conversation, but Naruto felt the need to say something every now and then to break up the silence. There had been a little talk about training but that had dried up pretty quickly. Now the boy was racking his brains to come up with something he felt comfortable talking to the man his father about. He wasn't really getting anywhere. What sorts of things do you talk about with someone you don't really like? He thought about discussing favorite foods, ramen, that was a category all its own, favorite colors, favorite movies, or favorite music, but those things seemed like topics for going on a date with a girl, or something. He considered asking for stories about life before he was born but he didn't want to take away stories that his mother wanted to share with him. And now he was grasping at mental straws for anything else. Hey, when I fought with Kiba he did this thing that sort of looked werewolf. Why? Do you know if that nasty black stuff he coughed up did that to him? No, Mangetsu replied as he forged on towards the distant outpost. That was an Inuzuka clan technique, and it's usually paired with the partner canine transforming into a clone of the human with the same feral features. Oh. Naruto frowned thoughtfully at the leaf-covered ground for a moment. So, they came up with that from watching werewolves. No, and never suggest anything like there where an Inuzuka can hear you. Naruto tilted his head and asked, why not? Because that will inspire the Inuzuka to punch you in the face, the Umbu explained. The Inuzuka clan and most of their techniques predate the arrival of the lycanthropy curse in these lands by centuries. They find it highly insulting to have their clan techniques compared in any way to werewolves, and regrettably many foreign ninja make that mistake. Okay, Naruto nodded. Well, there goes my plan to counter Kiba's kitty boy with werewolf wannabe. I forgot, the man remarked quietly, that you haven't been in Konoha all that long. The boy fidgeted with a leaf that he'd plucked off a bush. Mangetsu sounded sort of sad and it made him feel uncomfortable and awkward. Or maybe it was the impeding moonrise that was making his skin feel itchy. It was probably the moon. Ah, we're here. Naruto flinched and almost tripped into the Umbunin's back. Peering around the man, he could just make out a low-slung concrete bunker that was almost lost in the surrounding trees. It was getting harder to see by the minute and the patches of sky visible through the forest canopy had changed from the fiery colors of sunset to the purplish indigo of twilight. So it wouldn't be long. Mangetsu left him waiting outside of the bunker while he ducked inside to talk to whatever Umbu were present. Several long minutes later he came back out and guided Naruto along a different forest trail. The path seemed to dead end in a clearing and it seemed to satisfy the Umbu. Okay, pick your bush and let's get this over with, the man instructed, veering off to the left to strip and transform in private. Shrugging his pack off and leaving it dangling from one hand, Naruto wandered to the right until he found a sheltered spot formed by a clump of bushes wrapped around the base of a large tree. In the privacy of the greenery, he shucked off his clothes and shoes and shoved them into his bag. He winced a bit when he yanked off the bits of gauze still taped over his old injuries. It was very much like every other full moon in recent memory. And yet it was going to be completely different. Too impatient to wait for the moon to rise into view, Naruto triggered the change voluntarily. It took a bit more time and effort than he was used to, but only a little bit. And then he was fully furry and foxy and he felt fine. Grabbing his bag, he slunk out of the bushes and into the clearing where he flopped down onto the grass. Okay, I'm done. He fidgeted with the tip of his bushy fox tail as he waited for the werewolf, his father, to join him. The fox boy wondered what he was going to look like. The only werewolf he'd seen in the flesh before had been Oakamijiji and that poor creature had been skinny and sickly. A clump of hedges several yards away rustled and a shape emerged from them. The werewolf stood tall on his hind legs like a man instead of skulking around on all fours like a beast. His fur was golden yellow that shifted to white on his chest, stomach, throat, and the ends of his extremities, and his eyes were the same bright clear blue. This werewolf was the polar opposite of Oakamijiji. He ambled over and dumped his own bag beside Naruto's. The stars are barely out, the werewolf rumbled, Naruto's mind automatically translating the animal sounds into his father's voice, only a bit growly You're a bit early. So what? Naruto inhaled sharply and his fur bristled along his spine. The yellow fox leaned forward to sniff at the werewolf's hand. And then Naruto went so far as to smush his wet black nose into the fur on his arm to get an even better smell. He knew that scent. His father smelled far more wolfish in this shape, and that brought into focus why he found his scent so familiar before. It was free of dirt and sickness, but everything else was the same. He'd smelled it every full moon since he'd stumbled over that cave mere months after arriving in Konoha no Sato. Oh, Oakamijiji. Chapter 41, Fox vs. Wolf. Kushina struggled to remain patient as her Umbu guide Crane was inside the bunker-like outpost talking to whoever was inside to pinpoint Mangetsu's, and therefore Naruto's, location. The sun had set and the stars were coming out, but the moon hadn't risen yet so she wasn't unforgivably late yet. However, she was still a lot later in meeting up with her son than she wanted to be. She'd only intended to grab her bag before leaving the village so that she had something to put her clothes in when she took animal form to keep Naruto company during his night of weakness. But on her way out of the village with Crane, Mikoto had found her and insisted on talking with her. Kushina reluctantly put off her departure to assure her friend that she wasn't about to go off the handle and do something stupid and that she was quite rational now. And then Mikoto's disowned child, Sasuke, showed up. Apparently Mikoto hadn't really seen him since the clan elders had shown him the door, so there was a good amount of hugging and a few tears. Kushina almost slipped away then, but she remembered that Sasuke had been one of the kids who'd wanted to talk to her the day before, so she waited for things to settle down. When things were calmer, Sasuke started talking. She didn't like anything that he had to say to her. She'd known that something was up with Naruto yesterday, but what she had seen was nothing compared to what he'd apparently done earlier in the day. The reason that she'd found him with a fox tail and ears that afternoon was because a few hours earlier he'd been skirting the edges of the feral berserker state, not out of rage but out of stress and perhaps fear, and he'd terrorized some girl named Hinata in a desperate search for his mother. Sasuke told her pretty much everything that Naruto hadn't, except for why. Determined to find her son and drag answers out of him before the moon stole his voice for the night, Kushina excused herself while Mikoto puzzled over Naruto's werewolf nature with Sasuke. But before she could leave the village, Crane, who'd stuck to the shadows ever since Mikoto popped up, warned her that she was being followed. Byakuya Kashoka was tailing her, and before she could go to Naruto, she had to lose him. It took almost 2 hours to shake the brown fox. Kushina had almost been ready to turn around, chase the jerk down, and confront him. She did finally manage to shake him, though, but had only made her even later in leaving. To try and make up time, Crane had set a stiff pace to the distant outpost, leaving little breath for talking or asking questions, yet the sun had still set without Kushina reaching her son. I hope that Naruto doesn't decide to go off early. He and I need to have some words. I need to find out what set him off and remind him that it is not acceptable to terrorize little girls. The door to the bunker opened, spilling light out into the forming night, and Crane exited. I've got their location, he said. We aren't too far behind them. Great, lead the way. Crane started down a faint path that branched out to the east and she followed after him. As she walked, she took the barrette from her hair, the hitayate from her forehead, the crystal from around her neck, and shoved them into a side pocket on her bag. When she reached Naruto's location, she'd kick off her sandals and strip off her clothes to make the change. She'd left her chainmail shirt that she normally wore underneath her top off so that she would have fewer layers to shed tonight. The trail curved and started to widen. A wolfish scent filled her nose, tainted with a faint hint of something close to human, the hallmark of a werewolf. She half ran and got ahead of Crane, only to skid to a stop a handful of yards short of a clearing. And there she saw a monster looming over her son. The Umbu might have whispered something to her, but she couldn't hear him. Every fiber of her being was focused on what she had to do. She didn't waste time yanking off her clothing, she just set it on fire as she transformed. And even before she was completely done with the shift, she was racing to protect her baby, and kill what threatened him. Naruto really only bore a passing resemblance to a werewolf, Minato noted as he looked the transformed boy over. The markings on his pelt, vulpine eyes, and his bushy tail were the most obvious deviation. But to his experienced eye, which had seen dozens of other werewolves, even a few child wolves, there were plenty of other differences. His general build was more slender, his muzzle was shorter and narrower, the whiskers on his lips were a tad thicker and longer, his canines and claws were slightly smaller, and his ears were a touch bigger than they ought to be, even for a half-grown child. And there were little black stripes on his furry cheeks just like when he was human, a trait belonging to neither fur nor wolf, and a sign of his hybrid nature. It was nice to finally get a clear look at him. The first time he'd met the little fox creature his eyesight had already been failing from his chronic low-level silver poisoning. And even if his eyes had been perfect those 2 years ago, he wouldn't have labeled the child as a werewolf. But his mind wasn't so much on Naruto's unique features as what the boy had said. "Oakame, Jiji," he repeated slowly. "I'm sure that I looked awful with how sick I was, but did I really look old enough to be called Jiji?" "But," Naruto squeaked feebly, gaping up at him. "But, you died." "I came close to death, true," Minato nodded. "However, Hokage-sama was kind enough to give me the medical treatment that I needed even though he wasn't sure of my identity when I was first found." The little yellow fox whined and tugged on his black ears. But Hokage-sama didn't tell me that he had you." "And why didn't you say anything?" "My presence in Konoha is highly classified, and I'm sure that Hokage-sama wanted to teach you a lesson about not informing him when you found a potentially dangerous creature camped just outside the village." Minato took a moment to gather his thoughts before tackling the second question. "As for why I didn't say anything. When I first met you, I honestly wasn't sure what you were, let alone who you were. I very much enjoyed your company and I was afraid if I tried to say something, you wouldn't understand and be frightened off. And later, I wanted to get a better idea of who you were as a person. I knew that you didn't like me and I figured you'd feel betrayed if I introduced myself as your old tame werewolf friend first and then you learned that I was your father. I had planned on giving you hints tonight, and telling you directly, that we'd met long before. But you've gone and figured it out on your own. Naruto stared at him, wide-eyed, mouth slightly agape. And then he slumped, almost folding in on himself as he hugged his fluffy tail to his chest like it was a plush toy. He looked so small and lost and young. Minato hesitantly reached out to rub his son's head. The crackle hiss snarl of flames caught his ear's attention and he smelled a hint of smoke and burned cloth. He jerked his body back just in time to avoid the snap of carnivorous jaws going for this throat, although he did lose a tiny tuft of white fur. But there was no time to dwell on it. The owner of the toothy maw was still attacking. Startled by the attack, he'd been so focused on Naruto, and the Umbu at the bunker had claimed that the area was thoroughly cleared of anything dangerous that was larger than a cat, so he hadn't been keeping an ear out for any threats. All he could do was backpedal, desperately. For every stumble backwards it leapt forward with flashing teeth and flickering blue flames leaping from its fur. It was too close, moving too quickly, with too little light for him to see it clearly, but his nose was full of the scent of fire, smoke, chakra, and fox. Kitsune. Something fast-moving lashed out at him like a striking cobra and it managed to graze his shoulder, tearing loose more of his fur and drawing a little blood. Enemy Kitsune. His back brushed against a tree trunk and he dodged around behind it for a bit of cover. The Kitsune hesitated to follow him. Peeking around the other side of the tree through the cover of some brush he saw the human-sized fox crouched a yard or two away, bristling and snarling. It was a deep shade of red with blazing red eyes and 5 separate tails lashing in irritation. The Vulpin demon glanced over its shoulder at a cowering Naruto, who was clear across the small meadow, and defenseless. No. Peeling back his lips from his black gums, he snarled, exploded from the bushes, and tackled the growling Gobi, tangling with it in a fury of fur, teeth, and claws. You won't harm my son. Naruto crouched frozen by the 2 backpacks, paralyzed by horror. A mysterious Kitsune had darted in from nowhere in a blaze of blue fire and had done its best to rip his werewolf father to pieces. His father hadn't held still, though, and now he was on the attack, locked in a vicious struggle with the fox demon. What's going on? The fox flattened his ears to his skull and laid prone behind the flimsy shield of bags. Where did it come from? Who is it? It surely wasn't his mother. His mother only had 3 tails to her name. Although, she had sworn to him that her tails were getting itchy, and that meant that her 4th tail was bound to grow in soon. Could she have gotten up to 5 while he was away? Well, this sure went to hell. Naruto snapped his head around to see an Umbu lurked at the edge of the clearing where the trail dead ended. His mask was birdish with inky black markings that suggested a few falling feathers. The fox boy had seen him once or twice before, but the code name eluded him. Wait a minute, I told her, the Umbu sighed quietly. That's just Mangetsu, I said. Relax, he's a nice guy, I say to her. But does she listen to me? No, she doesn't. He shook his head in disgust. Why the heck did Mangetsu want her here if they were just going to fight like this? Wait a minute. Naruto whipped his head back to the snarling furry brawl. That's Mom. He lifted his head and sniffed at the air to see if he could get a good whiff of the Kitsune's smell. That is Mom. The brawling beasts tore at each other like wild animals instead of intelligent beings. They were so entangled and moving so quickly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. But then the werewolf got a bit of an upper hand. He pinned to the ground and straddled her back with one leg stretched back to hold down a few of her tails while he tried to bite the back of her neck and sever her spine. Meanwhile her free tails stabbed at his back with tips hardened into sharp spear points. They're killing each other. They're too close together, the Umbu muttered. I don't have any good way to separate them. I really wish I knew what this fight was about. The 2 combatants snarled and made all sorts of awful sounds as they struggled in the dirt. His mother's eyes burned a furious red as her tails flailed and blindly stabbed. His father's teeth tore at her fluffy scruff while his one free arm slapped at her attacking appendages. Naruto's heart raced and his stomach clenched, and then he hopped to his feet and flapped his arms at the ugly fight. "Stop! Stop it!" he wailed. "That's Mom! Stop biting her! Dad, stop!" At first his shouts seemed to have no effect, but then the werewolf paused and removed his jaws from the large fox's neck. "What?" Still keeping her pinned, he pressed his nose into her fur and inhaled. "Kushina? You smell different. Like a..." One of her 5 tails slapped him upside the head hard enough to stun him so that his grip loosened and she clawed her way free. As soon as she was on her feet again she whirled around and snapped at his ear, missing it by fractions of an inch. And when he tried to retreat from her, tail tucked between his legs in submission, she just chased him down with an awful roar no human or mundane fox could produce. "Now that I got him stopped, how am I going to stop Mom?" Minato hated it when his wolfish instincts got the better of him. With the full moon rising, those instincts were stronger, closer to the surface. So when he felt that Naruto was under threat, he hadn't reacted as a ninja and made smart moves like opening up the range to use destructive jutsu to end the fight quickly and decisively. No, instead he'd charged in like a wild animal for an up-close and personal physical brawl with fangs and claws. He also hadn't given any thought to try and determine who was trying to attack them. There really hadn't been much time to, with her fast and relentless assault. He certainly hadn't imagined that it was Kushina. Even though he knew that she was a kitsune, he'd never seen her beast form before, or smelled any hint of fox on her. So not recognizing Kushina when she appeared in a blaze of blue fire and tried to rip out his throat was a perfectly understandable mistake, he thought. However, she didn't seem to agree with that. "Kushina," he yelped as she latched onto his wrist with her sharp teeth. "Ow! Stop! I'm sorry." She gave no sign that she had heard him. Her tail tips had gone from sharp spears to curved hooks that tried to get some purchase in his fur and hinder his range of motion. Minato reluctantly slapped her head to force her to let go and then used his Hiraishin to warp out of her deadly reach and up into the branches of the tree that he'd used as cover for his transformation minutes earlier. While she snarled and looked around frantically for him, he took stock of his injuries. They weren't as bad as they could have been. His thick pelt of fur had acted like padding, making it difficult for her teeth and tail-formed weapons to penetrate down to his skin. But she had scored several lacerations and small punctures that streaked his golden yellow fur with blood, and she'd torn out dozens of chunks of fur with her jaws. She probably had the same sorts of injuries, and fur loss, but with her red fur it was a bit harder to see the blood. Minato sighed and dropped down from the tree and tried to reason with her again now that there was some space between them. "Kushina, that's enough. Calm down and we'll talk." "It's no use," Naruto interrupted from his spot back by the bags. "She won't understand. All she hears is animal noise, not words." "Really?" Minato frowned. "That's very unfortunate." His attempts at communication only caught her attention and she spun around to charge him again with another inhuman, unfox-like roar. She dashed at him in an arc so that she could get between him and Naruto before she was on him again. Minato didn't wait around for her to tackle him again, so he bolted left, back into the middle of the small meadow to try and keep clear of Naruto's position so the boy would stay safe. He was really getting a good appreciation for why the Kitsune species had been rated between A and S rank. It was very hard to keep track of 5, in this case, lashing tails, which had no trouble moving independently of each other and were ridiculously flexible, as well as the end that had sharp, snapping teeth. If the area had been thoroughly seeded with Hiraishin seals like he'd planned on before the attempt on Naruto's life, he would have had the advantage. But, as he wasn't out to kill or maim Kushina, his options were extremely limited to the point where he felt that he was the underdog in this fight. Her wild tail strikes hissed through the air, and the low blows tore up the ground. Then she'd suddenly lunge forward with bared teeth to try and land a bite while he was busy avoiding getting skewered. She was so wound up that her tongue was lolling out of the side of her mouth and she was started to foam around her lips. Her pupils were dilated down to narrow slits that were all but lost in the malevolent glow of her red eyes. Those eyes made him think of Naruto and how he'd looked when he'd been upset and grappling with the unhappy realization that the father he despised had been close by for days. Red eyes seemed to be a strong indication of a heightened and decidedly negative emotional state. Or, maybe her eyes just happened to be red in beast form, he didn't know. As he leapt aside from another of her wild lunges, he was struck by a sort of pattern to her movements. She attacked him with an almost insane level of aggression, but she always was trying to drive him away from Naruto's position. Since he hadn't recognized her, it was likely that she hadn't recognized him and, like him, had assumed he was out to get Naruto and was defending him accordingly. And with the full moon in the sky, he couldn't just change back into a man and correct her assumption. This is really ridiculous, he thought as he rolled out of the way of her very unfriendly pounce after she'd tripped him with two of her tails. This needs to stop now. I can't wait for her to get tired. She's barely used any chakra so far, so she could last for hours. Making up his mind, Minato raced away from Kushina, then stopped and tried to present her with his most dominant posture. He fluffed up his fur, stood upright, kept his tail raised high, held out his arms, pricked forward his ears, and did whatever he could to make himself look as large as possible. And to top it off, he let out his own roar, a sound that was closer to the bellow of a bear or a lion than the bark of a wolf. Hopefully this will intimidate her into stopping her attack. Then I should be able to demonstrate to her one of my signature techniques. The Rasengan would probably be best. And that ought to get her thinking of my identity. If that doesn't work, I think I'll have to go hide in the woods for an hour or two until she calms down and is ready to deal with me more rationally. She stopped short of tackling him yet again, and belched a jet of blue flame like she was a small, furry dragon. Minato was forced to use Hydration again, warping to a temporary spot he'd set by slapping a seal onto a large rock near the heart of the small meadow. Even though the flames hadn't touched him, the fur on his chest and face felt singed. And the glare from the bright fire left splotches dancing through his vision. Crap. He rubbed at his eyes and tried to channel chakra to them so that they'd recover as quickly as possible. I'll have to retreat, then, and wait for her to relax. He started to turn to inform Naruto of his plan. His warp hadn't taken him to a spot directly behind her, so Kushina quickly spied him and sprinted towards him to renew her med-attack. There was a whistling shriek, like a bottle rocket, followed by a crack pop and a flash that went off mere inches from Kushina's nose, and she braked so hard that she was practically sitting. The flash further blinded Minato and he blinked furiously, trying to get rid of the pulsing blobs of color that made it hard to see. But his nose wasn't crippled in the least, and he smelled. Naruto? Naruto fidgeted as he watched the two bestial adults continue to fight. The werewolf wasn't trying to hurt the fox anymore, but she didn't seem to notice. His mother was intent on tearing his father's head off no matter how long it took. The old text said that kitsune were fairly genjutsu resistant, but this is insane, the masked Umbunin quietly complained from his safe spot just inside the tree line. It's like she isn't even aware of it. I wish I knew more single-target illusions. Why don't you actually go and do something? Naruto snarled at him. The Umbu couldn't understand him, but the man seemed to be able to guess what he'd said. I'm not about to get in the middle of that, he replied, keeping his voice low. I don't want to worry about which one might have bitten me. Mangetsu's a good guy, but accidents happen, especially in a fight like this. And he's still holding his own well enough. We're not in a populated area, there aren't civilian safeties to worry about. I don't need to get involved. His voice dropped lower, like he was muttering to himself, but Naruto's sharp ears still heard him. And today's supposed to be my day off, damn it. This was not a part of the deal. All Mangetsu asked for was for me to bring her here before nightfall. If he was expecting a fight, he should have told me so, and that would have cost him more than a free dinner. Naruto swallowed and turned his focus back to the fight. The werewolf tried to break off the fight away, running and then turning to put on an intimidating display, complete with a loud and scary roar. The kitsune wasn't fazed and she retaliated with a blast of blue fire. Whoa! The werewolf reappeared several yards to the kitsune's left. He looked unharmed, but with how he was blinking and rubbing at his eyes it was clear that the sudden bright light from the fire had impaired his vision. But the large fox spied him and charged in for the kill before he could recover. Naruto did what he did best, acted without thinking. He gathered blue fire to his right hand and moved like he was hurling a kunai. A little ball of blue fire streaked off with a shriek. He'd intended for it to whiz past his mother's nose, but it actually exploded in front of her nose. It stopped her, though. And then he made a mad dash across the clearing to put himself between the two feuding creatures. Standing in front of the werewolf, he faced his mother and struggled not to wilt under her piercing red eyes. He held up a black, trembling, paw-like hand palm out in the stop gesture. "Mommy, stop it right now. You'll be really sad if you rip his head off, I swear." Her entire being was focused on saving her child and destroying the monster that threatened him. At first she had been willing to let it go if it ran and didn't come back. But then it had attacked her and she knew that she could show it no mercy. It was a slippery and persistent foe, but she wouldn't let up. She had been apart from her son for far too long. Nothing was going to take him away from her ever again. Nothing. But then a flash of Kitsunebai halted her in her tracks. She recognized the attack of one of her own kind. Her senses sharpened as she sought this new enemy. And then her son appeared and placed himself directly in front of the wolf monster, held out his hand to halt her, and yapped at her like he was trying to speak. Panic gripped her heart and she tried to use two of her tails to grab Naruto and move him away from the danger, but he ducked away from the grasping tail claws and stood firm, well within the grasp of the werewolf. Adrenaline sung in her veins and a red haze clung to her vision. She wanted to attack the danger she needed to, but she couldn't. Naruto was in the way. "Naruto!" she snarled, forcing her mouth to work. "Move." He looked nervous, but he slowly and deliberately shook his head and remained where he was. Confusion muddled her thoughts. Why wouldn't he listen to her? Didn't he know that thing was dangerous? Why was he defending it from her? Hadn't he seen how aggressive it was? Why hadn't the werewolf snatched her son and carried him off for dinner now that he was standing so close to it? Why? She mumbled, wobbling a bit on her paws, her muscles so tense that they ached. Her child hesitated, then slowly backed up, moving closer to the werewolf. When he was standing right beside it, he leaned over and licked at the towering creature's bleeding wrist. And then he patted the beast's larger white hand with his little black one, as if to prove that he was good and friendly. The whole time the golden-furred wolf didn't so much as twitch, let alone make any sort of threatening move towards her or her child. Kushina sat back on her haunches and slowly lowered her tails into a more neutral position. "Okay, I'm confused. Will you listen to me now?" Crane asked from the edge of the clearing, her bag in his hand. "You said something." Kushina mumbled. "When did my bag get scorched like that?" "I was telling you that was Mangetsu and to not worry about him," Crane tartly informed her. "But you just wanted to bite his head off, literally. I thought you met him yesterday." Her thoughts slogged through her rising confusion and the waning red mists of berserk rage. "But he was a man. He's a werewolf," the Umbu told her. "And tonight's the full moon, if you hadn't noticed. Didn't you talk to him at all yesterday?" She opened and closed her mouth a few times before hanging her head. No." Crane made an irritated sound in the back of his throat and dragged her bag over to where two others lay on the grass. Kushina blinked and turned back to her son and the werewolf, Mangetsu. Seeing that her attention had returned, the werewolf very slowly raised his right hand-like paw so that the palm was facing skyward. And then, slowly and clearly, began gathering and molding chakra. There were a few threads at first. Then more and more of them swirled out of his hand. They spun into a tight tangle, a dense sphere about the size of a softball. The highly compacted turbulent storm of magical energy made a sound somewhere between a loud hum and a faint howl. And he did it all without a single hand seal to shape it. He held it there for a minute, and then allowed it to dissipate once he was certain that she recognized it. She stared into his blue eyes, stupefied, as a deep sense of shock oozed through her veins that had burned hot with adrenaline moments before. And then a word tumbled out of her mouth. "Oops." Namikaze Minato clapped a hand paw to his forehead and sighed deeply. Chapter 42, Tumultuous Tuesday. Mikato frowned slightly as she forged her way towards the hotel where Kushina was staying shortly after breakfast. Despite the redhead's promises the day before that everything was fine, Mikato really didn't believe her. And she had a lot of other questions to ask her. Uzumaki Naruto couldn't be a werewolf. Perhaps he'd only inherited part of the curse from his father, which had been why he'd reacted to the silver test that Fugaku had forced on him. But werewolves didn't look the least bit like a fox, or sprout tails without the full moon as the catalyst. Kushina wasn't shocked when she heard about his transformation from Sasuke. She was far more concerned with the cause of his emotional distress and that he'd scared an old classmate. There's more to her son than she's letting on. Thinking about her son's mysterious teammate eventually led her to think of other things. Perhaps Naruto's very unusual traits had something to do with his mother's side of the family. She thought about Kushina's odd and erratic behavior in the previous days, and how mysterious her home village Azushiagaku or no Sato was, despite being an ancient ally of Konoha's. Firmly shoving aside vague suspicions and barely formed theories, Mikoto slipped through the hotel lobby and up the stairs to the second floor where Kushina's room was. "What the hell happened to you?" Mikoto demanded. Some amazing quirk of timing had allowed Mikoto to stumble upon Kushina apparently returning to her room, in clothes that didn't look like hers. She was dressed in some loose gray pants and a cheap black t-shirt. But what was really alarming was that her shoes and backpack looked a bit crispy, like she'd run through a bonfire. "Were you out all night?" The Uchiha frowned, noting her friend's messy hair and some faint dark circles under her eyes. Kushina jumped guiltily, almost dropping her room key, and she fidgeted with her crystal necklace while grinning a bit too broadly. "Mikoto, hey. You're up early." "Not really," Mikoto replied, folding her arms over her chest. "What happened?" "Well, I jumped to some conclusions and got into a fight and ruined my clothes, but it was just a crazy misunderstanding." Kushina explained brightly, tangling her necklace between her fingers. "It's all sorted out now, though. It won't happen again." "You got into a fight that ruined your clothes?" Mikoto gasped. "It really wasn't that bad." Kushina protested. "I didn't have to go to the hospital or anything, see?" The red-haired woman showed off a handful of bruises and stretches of red, irritated skin, but otherwise she was completely unharmed as she claimed to be. "So, what was the misunderstanding?" Mikoto asked warily. "It's complicated," Kushina muttered evasively. "And involves Umbu, and probably some village secrets." "Right." Mikoto nodded dubiously. "Yeah, well, I need to go shower and get some real clothes and maybe take a nap at some point, so I'll see you tomorrow." Before the Uchiha could respond, the Uzumaki unlocked her hotel room door, ducked inside, and shut the door again, leaving Mikoto alone in the hallway. "Tomorrow?" Mikoto repeated blankly. "Why not today?" "I'm busy today." Kushina called through the closed door. "I'll see you tomorrow then," Mikoto sighed. "At lunch." "Deal." Shortly afterwards, Mikoto could hear the faint sounds of the shower running, and the dark-haired woman turned and walked away. "I should probably make a list of questions for her to answer tomorrow so I don't have to worry about forgetting anything." Minato sagged against his kitchen counter under the oppressive weight of his fatigue. The full moon was always a bit draining, whether he changed or not, but the added stress of the fight against Kushina and healing the fresh wounds that she'd dealt him left him even more tired than usual. Only sheer force of will and the caffeine from his coffee was keeping him conscious at the moment. The coffee maker that he'd acquired for his kitchen was a very fancy model. It had a built-in clock and a timer that allowed for it to be set to go off in the morning and start brewing coffee automatically. Before leaving for the outpost he'd loaded it with coffee grounds, and when he and Naruto returned shortly after sunrise there was a hot pot of coffee waiting for him. That coffee had kept him awake enough to cook breakfast. A good breakfast was essential after a full moon night of forced transformation and insomnia, and he made sure that Naruto stayed up long enough to stuff himself with pancakes before allowing the boy to crawl off to bed. Minato intended to finish off the coffee pot and shower before he joined his son in sleep. What a night, he thought around a yawn. After Kushina had calmed down and received some vital information from Crane, the evening had been very uneventful. She drifted in and out of mental shock for hours and stuck to his side the whole night, cleaning off the blood from both their pelts with her tongue. Minato had spent his wolf time adjusting to Kushina's new foxy smell, which Naruto informed him was not new at all. It was how she was supposed to smell all the time, and wrestling with his wolfish instincts to reaffirm his physical bond with his mate, a difficult prospect considering how long he'd been alone and without female companionship, but very necessary as Naruto was present. And once Naruto was sure that there would be no more fighting, the boy relaxed and started goofing off, running around, pouncing on tails, mainly Kushina's, out of boredom, asking questions about the things that he smelled, and almost begging to be taught the Rasengan, especially after Minato had been persuaded to demonstrate what it could actually do. If we could have skipped the brawl, it wouldn't have been so bad. A ripple ran through his web of perimeter seals and Minato paused, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. When he recognized Kushina's chakra, he sighed and pushed off the counter and stumbled to the back door. He disengaged the seals and opened the door. Kushina stared at him, like she still couldn't believe her eyes. Her long red hair looked wet and she was dressed in more flattering clothing than the replacements she'd acquired from the Umbu outpost for the outfit that she'd burned to ash. She hesitated, then traced her fingers over his cheek, and then hurled herself at him with a strangled whimper that almost made him drop his coffee. "Good morning," Minato mumbled into her damp hair and eased her fully inside so that he could seal the door again. "Morning," she choked out into his shoulder as she clung to him and trembled. "Can I cook you breakfast?" "Too late," he chuckled. "I already made pancakes." "Shoot. Have you eaten?" he asked. "No," she grumbled. "I was going to cook for you and Naruto. How about oatmeal?" When she agreed to that suggestion, he brought her into the kitchen and whipped up a bowl for her. While she ate, he poured himself the last cup of coffee and watched her, suddenly feeling a lot less sleepy. For a short stretch of time, it was like they hadn't been apart for nearly a decade and a half. They were just a man and a woman having breakfast in a companionable silence. He drank in her beauty with his eyes while she was too busy eating to notice his stare. Her fox form was interesting, and his inner wolf found it exotic and intriguing. But her human form was what he'd always known, and all of him was entranced by it. "So, Naruto's asleep now?" she asked after her spoon scraped the bottom of the bowl. "Yep," he nodded and drained the last of his coffee from his mug. Kushina fiddled with her crystal pendant, sliding it back and forth along its cord, and chewed at her lower lip. There was clearly something very weighty on her mind. Minato settled back and waited for her to work out what she wanted to say. "You haven't showered yet, have you?" That was not the sort of thing he had expected her to ask. "No," he blinked. "Why? Do I stink?" "No," she snorted and removed her necklace, something he'd never seen her do before, and the foxish scent from the previous night returned almost instantaneously. "You smell fine," she grinned, looking oddly fox-like even though she hadn't shapeshifted at all. "Okay," he said slowly, his mind scrambling and flailing against fatigue. "I was just going to offer to wash your back for you." "But, haven't you showered already?" he asked, puzzled. She came very close to glaring at him. "Whoa. Oh. Right," he coughed nervously, his sluggish mind finally keying into the fact that washing his back was the least of what she was really offering. "Yes, please, please, please. Let's do that." "I don't know," she grumbled, pinning him with a narrow look. "Now that I think about it, I'm not sure that I want to find out how I stack up against all the experiences you've had while roaming remote forests." "My name is Minato, not Jiraiya," he snapped a bit more sharply than he'd meant to. "And wolves are monogamous when they pair bond, you know." Kushina blinked, and her dark blue eyes grew soft, almost misty. "So, you've been as lonely as I have," she murmured softly, "even though you really didn't have to." "Neither did you," he pointed out, equally softly, the insult immediately forgotten. Her eyes changed, the pupils turning Vulpin, and they glittered predatorily as she stood up, walked around the kitchen table, and pulled him up from his seat by his shirt collar. His heart rate speed up instantly and he felt wide awake. It took every bit of his self-control, which felt quite frayed and feeble at the moment, to hold still and wait. "Well, Mr. Namikaze," she practically purred, flashing him a pointy-toothed smile and tapping him on the tip of his nose with a suddenly claw-like fingernail. "You just set the boyfriend bar ridiculously high, and I don't settle." Then she kissed him before he could get to her first, and a tiny corner of his mind wondered why she'd suggested the shower when the kitchen table was so much closer. The Hokage sighed in relief when his wife interrupted the tedium of his office by bringing him his lunch. He gratefully pushed his paperwork aside and started unpacking the bento box. Biawao pulled up a chair to his desk and poured herself a cup of tea from a thermos she'd also brought along. "So," she said before he could start eating, are you sure that Mangetsu shouldn't give his report of the Uchiha incident in person instead of another Umbu reading the written account? I'm sure that it would make the proceedings much simpler. It would, Sarutobi agreed. However, as soon as he started talking, his identity would be revealed to all of the major clan heads. I would very much like to keep his presence in the village a secret for as long as possible. Swear them to secrecy, his wife suggested. Declare knowledge of Mangetsu's true identity be an S-class secret. It's well within your power. I could do that, he nodded. And I'm sure that most of the clans would respect my orders. The Uchiha, however, would not react well, and considering the state of their relationship with the rest of the village, I believe Fuyugaka would leak Mangetsu's name, at the very least. I suppose so, Biawao grimaced. But you can't keep him in the shadows forever. Why not unveil him now when you have the most control over what the other clans know of him? The fewer people know about him, the less likely it is for Orochimaru and his allies to learn of his return. The old man scowled, a bitter taste filling his mouth. My old student will strike out at us soon, and as much as I hate to, I think it's best to use the image of a vulnerable and divided village to draw him out. If he were to know about Mangetsu, Orochimaru would hesitate, hold back and gather a much greater force to his cause. He's no fool. His hatred, arrogance, and most importantly ignorance, are the greatest weapons we have against him at this time, and hopefully it will give us the edge that will crush him and the Uzashionin who have joined with him. A preemptive strike would be better, the old woman countered. Orochimaru wouldn't expect us to strike first. In order to do that, we would need a great deal more information on Orochimaru's movements, and the trials would have to be cancelled. Sarutobi took the thermos of tea from his wife and poured his own glass. I've already tried to suggest cancelling, postponing, or even moving up the trials so that we can focus our might on dealing with this rising external threat, but the Fire Daimyo doesn't see enough reason to do anything so drastic. Drastic? She snorted derisively. That's downright conservative compared to what other cages have done in similar situations. There isn't much solid proof that I could show him, the Hokage shrugged. Most of what we know is second, even third-hand information channeled through Jiraiya from the Uzumaki, a source that is somewhat suspect. And what we believe is going to happen is pure speculation on our part. It's not wild guessing, it's logic, his wife argued. Surely the daimyo can connect the dots. The daimyo has a different perspective than we do, a different purpose. He leaned back in his chair and sighed when his back twinged a bit. He thinks in terms of trade, diplomacy, and stability. It is his job to make peace work. Our job is to protect peace, and when that isn't possible, to make war work for our side so that peace can return swiftly. I know, Biawao grimaced. I know. It's just so frustrating to have so many obstacles in the way of what we have to do. If there were no laws in our way, life would just be too easy, Sarutobi chuckled. And we can't have that, it would be boring. His wife rolled her eyes at him, but she smiled and the mood was lightened just enough for the two of them to enjoy their lunch. Naruto tried to relax and act casual as he walked through the village streets as evening was falling over Konoha. He was far away from the Uchiha district, most villagers were eating dinner or spending time with their families, and his mother was with him. He was perfectly safe. But outside of the anonymous walls of Mangetsu's house, and with Mangetsu napping on the couch back in that house, he couldn't help but eye every shadowy alleyway and side street in search of angry hunters with silver knives and poisoned darts. Naruto. He flinched and glanced up at his mother sheepishly. You need to relax. She reached over and ruffled his hair. You focus on getting us to Iruka's apartment and I'll keep watch for any baddies skulking around, okay? Okay, Naruto agreed, forcing a grin. They were on their way to Iruka's apartment to collect his clothes, ninja gear, and any other necessities so that he could go on a training trip for the rest of the break between the Forest of Death and the final trial. Once he was all packed, they would go back to the abandoned-looking house and have dinner. And after that he would be taken to some remote location on the fringes of Fire Country to slave away the next few weeks to rebuild and expand his strength. When he'd woken up from his post-full moon nap and started on his very late lunch, he had learned of this game plan and been very upset. If he left Konoha to train, he wouldn't be able to see his mother because she had business to complete in the village. Before he could totally freak out over that, however, they presented him with a deal. I came up with this plan before your mother returned, his father had explained while nursing a steaming mug of coffee. And now that she's here, I've made some adjustments. During the week, you'll be working with me, and on the weekends I'll bring her out so that you can train with her. How does that sound? It sounded fantastic. Sure, his father could probably teach him a lot about being a ninja and a werewolf, but he didn't know anything about the sorts of things his mother's kind could do. Messing around with the blue fire on his own was fun and all, but it would probably be better to have someone to learn from who knew what they were doing. And his mother could bring him treats, like Ichiraku ramen, when she visited, too. Although, he would have to share his mother's attention now, she would be coming to see his father as much as she would be coming to see him. It was an uncomfortable thought. But not nearly as uncomfortable as the odd smell he'd come across in the kitchen when he'd been looking for lunch, which had reminded him of a few incidents from a few of the less happy homes he'd stayed in. I didn't see it, he thought, firmly shoving the mixed sense of his parents and what it could mean into a little mental box and chucking it deep into a dark corner of his mind, so it didn't happen. Focus on the training that I'm going to get. Naruto managed a more genuine grin as he closed in on the neighborhood where Irika's apartment building was. Training was going to be hard, he was sure, but it would be fun, too. He was going to learn new things and get stronger. When he'd initially strived to become a ninja, it had been solely to gain enough strength to rescue his mother from the cold grasp of her family. But then she'd gotten free on her own, and while he was ecstatic to be with her again, his goal was suddenly pointless. For a few hours, he'd felt lost as to what he should do. It seemed silly to continue with such a demanding path if it wasn't going to do anything for him. That hadn't lasted long, though. I won't be getting stronger for Mom anymore, I'll be getting stronger for me. I'll get strong enough to defend myself. I'm tired of being afraid. A rustling sound from just inside an alley near a cluster of garbage cans made Naruto squeak and grab onto his mother's arm. Naruto! His mother squawked, almost tripping. There was something. A calico cat peeked out of the shadows of an overturned garbage can at him. Never mind, the boy muttered, immediately letting go and feeling very stupid. That cat reminds me of a chronic D-rank mission, his red-haired mother mused as the alley cat ditched the can and darted deeper into the gap between the two buildings. I really hated chasing that Tora-chan down. You know that cat, too. Naruto blinked. That thing must be immortal. That cat's still around. His mother sputtered. No, it can't be. That old lady must just name every new cat Tora-chan, and treat all the poor beasts the same. Yeah, Naruto agreed. They reached the doors to the building and Naruto led the way upstairs. He climbed a few flights of stairs and scampered down a hallway to stop in front of one of the doors, his mother barely 2 steps behind him. Since he'd lost his keys along with pretty much everything but his Hitaiate in the attack on him and the scramble to save his life, he had to knock on the door and wait to be let in. The Chunin answered the door almost immediately and he looked sort of frantic. Naruto. The academy teacher dragged him into a quick, fierce hug, and then pushed him back so that he could get a good look at the boy. You're alright. Of course I am. Naruto frowned. Why wouldn't I be? No one would tell me anything, not even Kakashi could give me any real information. I wasn't even allowed to visit. Irika's grip on Naruto's shoulders almost painfully tight. For all I knew you were in some hidden hospital room hovering on death's doorstep. Oh. The boy shifted awkwardly. Well, I'm okay now. Can I come in and get my stuff? Your stuff? Irika blinked. You're leaving. For my training, Naruto nodded. You're moving out for your training. The Chunin frowned. He'll be training outside of the village for security reasons, his mother explained. Irika jumped a bit and did a little double take, like he hadn't noticed her presence at all. How long will he be gone? The academy teacher asked her, suddenly turning stiff and wooden. Until the final trial, Naruto's mother replied with a slight shrug. After that, Naruto slipped past Irika and hurried into the apartment and the room that he had lived in until recently. He pulled out his duffel bags and started stuffing them with the things that he'd need. When he was done, the only things left behind were a few old scrolls, his digital alarm clock, the movie poster taped to the wall, and a dust bunny ranch underneath his bed. Grabbing his toothbrush and shampoo as he passed by the bathroom, he headed back for the adults by the door. The stiff air between the two grown ups had intensified into something nearly explosive in the 10 minutes or so that he'd been away from them. Erika was giving his mother a cold stare, and his mother had a murderous look in her eye as she glowered back at him. There hadn't been any shouting, or even loud talking, but they had argued about something. Naruto swallowed and nervously scratched at his cheek. His voice seemed to have broken the ugly staring contest. Erika looked away from Naruto's mother and was once again the smiling, friendly teacher. The red-haired woman made a hissing sound and made an effort to regain her composure. "So, you have everything you need, Naruto?" his old teacher asked. "Yeah," the boy nodded slowly. "Great." Erika patted his shoulder, his smile turning a bit sad. "Do your best with this training, and remember that you're always welcome here." "Okay," Naruto said warily. "See you later, I guess." Then he gave a semi-formal bow. "Thank you for letting me live with you, Erika-sensei." "It was no trouble at all," the scarred Chunin replied. Naruto slipped out the door and into the hallway. His mother didn't immediately follow, so Naruto waited a few doors down. With how pissed off his mom had looked, he worried that there might be some more arguing before she would leave. "If I didn't feel that I owed you a debt of gratitude for treating my son decently, I would have given you a few new scars," she growled harshly. "Learn some manners. They might save your life someday." And then she stormed off to join him and head for the stairs down. "Erika-sensei needs to learn manners." Naruto muttered in disbelief as he nearly had to run to keep up with his mother's stiff pace. "But he's always so polite and respectful." "Well, except when someone pisses him off. Like that one time with the stink bombs during that test. He really yelled at me that time." "Yeah, sure," his mother snarled. "He makes all these comments that say that I don't love you and that I got rid of you, and I tell him that there were lots of problems with my family and village, and then he wants to hear them and I can't tell him, so he calls my reasons a bunch of BS and acts all high and mighty." Naruto cringed as they exited the apartment building and returned to the village streets. "But enough about that rude brat," she huffed. "Let's go get some nice takeout for dinner. I don't think your father will be awake enough to cook anything really good. We probably had a little too much fun this morning." "Yeah, let's get Ichiraku's," Naruto cried and hurried off to the noodle stand. "And let's not talk about whatever you did with Dad while I was sleeping." The moon, which was starting its waning cycle, was almost lost over the bright lights of the Land of Lightning's biggest resort town, renowned for its casinos. The streets were busy with tourists, even at this late hour. Everyone was seeking to satiate a vice, or cater to one. In one of the smaller gambling houses a young-looking blonde woman strode towards one of the card tables. She was very well endowed up top, and several other patrons of the establishment couldn't help but stare as the pig-tailed beauty walked past. Hot on her heels was a dark-haired girl with a seemingly perpetual nervous expression and a pink pet pig in her arms. The blonde woman in the green gambler jacket appeared ignorant of her shadow and joined a new card game, slamming down an impressive number of chips and gesturing to the dealer to hand over some cards. The men already at the table were amused to have a woman join them and were very eager to strip her of her hefty pile of chips. Cards were passed around, measuring looks exchanged, tokens shoved into the pot, and some players folded out. When all the moves were made, the remaining players showed their hands. The men sighed and swore when they found that the busty blonde had the winning hand. But she didn't look happy. She looked horrified. "I won." Across the room, in a shadowy spot near a bank of noisy pachinko machines, an old woman in faded clothing with her silver hair up in two buns stood watching with a hint of a smile on her face. "I have found you, descendant of mine." That's it for part 14. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.